today. We've got to find a way of freeing our economy by helping freeing businessmen from their cells. The Hank Reardons today may not be running a whorehouse. You remember the lines when his mother tries to force him to hire his brother. But they do live in one. They operate in the political world of Washington, and if that's not a whorehouse, I don't know what is. To find their way out, they must take politics as seriously as they take their core businesses. They operate in two worlds, the private world of competition and the political world of wealth redistribution and all the other things it has. They need to understand both, and they need to seek allies in both of those groups. Businessmen would not allow their waistlines to clog. Why do they permit so much muck to be thrown at them in Washington, D.C.? Reardon's comment to a Dr. Ferris quote illustrates the risk of the mixed economy, another risk of the mixed economy. Reardon talks to this political official. He said, "But I did break one of your laws." And Ferris's response is instructive. "Well, what do you think they're for?" The whole idea is create a world where everyone is in violation of the law, and then you have the ability to blackmail them, greenmail them, whatever, into something. Rand was prophetic also in her understanding of the insanity that such statist interventions would create. In a discussion of the implementation of the Fair Share Law, intended to equalize or reduce demands of a crippled market, Reardon struggles to find out how much Reardon metal he can produce. His chief competitor, Boyle, Associated Steel, has more capacity, but it's inferior. Nobody wants to buy it. So the challenge is whether capacity or sales is a relevant baseline. He is told, quote, he could produce Reardon metal in an amount that Orrin Boyle could have produced if he could have produced it. Rand would have loved to have discussed the emission trading system that now comes forward in global warming. You said 10 minutes, you're going to give me a 10-minute warning. Okay, business, politics, and technology. Dr. Robert Statler, you recall, was a brilliant individualist, now an honored Mandarin of the state, pushed for the creation of the State Science Institute. Notice the SS Institute. I thought that was interesting. Like many intellectuals, he makes an artificial distinction between research and development, and it's an interesting point. But since I have 5 minutes, I think I'll put it aside right now.
4 minutes.
John was supposed to give me a 10-minute warning, which meant I started speeding up at that point. Now I'm speeding up. There's a lot to say about the, let me give you one about the precautionary principle. Politicized science has its costs, many costs. One cost is the extent to which you can terrorize people by vague and innuendos. Orrin Boyle, the Associated Steel, wants to scare people away from using Reardon metal, and he says it's a threat to public safety. Children may be placed at risk. We're not sure that there aren't unrealized dangers. Today, that approach is embodied in the precautionary principle, which essentially says if you don't know everything about a substance, you shouldn't be allowed to use it. The language of the report says it may be possible after a period of heavy usage, a southern fissure may appear, although the length of that period can't be determined. There's a possibility of a molecular reaction, present unknown. There may be the tensile strength, but it could fail after a certain period of time. No evidence to support the contention we shouldn't use it, but it should be prohibited. And they point out, Eddie points out here, Dagny's aide, you can't answer that. There's no way you can make that argument anything other than an unanswerable question. The fears aren't explicit enough to even be rejected. That's the kind of arguments that now center around global warming, as John said. How does Rand resolve all this? This is my final part. Rand, like Schumpeter, is well aware of the self-destructive elements in capitalism, the way in which capitalism creates its own enemies, how intellectuals would and should and would could and would seek to destroy the market. Her resolution of this issue was to have them withdraw, Atlas shrugging. But that dramatic device, for the novel purposes, is not likely to work in practice. But Rand does not close the door for a more active stance. At several places in the novel, Rand disparages public affairs, the public be damned, yet she herself spends much of her life creating this exciting and compelling novel. Her novel was popular, and she never minded that fact. Her heroes liked billboards, which are advertising mechanisms. She was fierce, and Reardon was fierce in making sure that people understood why Reardon metal was a good thing. His heroes all named their companies after themselves, advertising too. And in the end, John Galt reached out to the whole nation through television or through radio, although had I been John Galt's advisor, I would have suggested that a 3-hour soundbite is a little much for most people. But it is not surprising that Rand did not have a positive agenda for addressing how we separate the problems we've got ourselves in the mixed economy. Schumpeter never addressed or solved this problem either. To a large extent, we're part of the answer to that. Groups of people who can give the business community, the entrepreneurial community, a part of its soul. We're battered business bureaus, and our job is to help business find its way out of this morass. But we need more. We in the policy community should reach out ourselves to reach the creators of the world. We've got to find a way of thinkers like ourselves meeting doers like them. And business itself has to take politics seriously. It has to recognize that the problems, its attention it gives to the locomotives and the blast furnaces has to be coupled with the attention it gives to cleaning out the sewers in Washington and the corporate bathrooms, as a matter of fact. But those are for the future. Rand has given us some answers and the motivation to fight the growth of the state. That she did not address all should not in any way distract from what she achieved. Her motivation is about as dramatic as you can get. It was inspiring, albeit a bit terrifying. It evoked a very apocalyptic vision of the final days of statism. If you recall, they're flying back from New England. They look down at New York City. They see a city in collapse. And this is the quotes. The last train line having been cut, New York City had been thrown back on its own resources. They could see the last convulsions. The lights of the cars were darting through the streets like animals trapped in a maze. The bridges were jammed with cars, glittering bottlenecks, stopping all motion. The desperate screaming of sirens. Men were deserting their posts, trying in panic to abandon New York, seeking escape where all roads were cut off and escape was no longer possible. And then the lights of New York go out. Rand realized that the fight we're involved in is a fight for civilization. It's a fight worth the fighting. It's a fight we have to do. But then in the end, she went back to a positive note. Atlas Shrugged went back to Galt's Gulch, and John Galt said, "We are going back to the world." Well, we in the public policy world have never left it, but we can learn much how to wage our battles, to craft our messages by reading and rereading and rereading this great gateway novel. Thank you.
Who says Ayn Rand wasn't prescient in her book? Fred's description of New York City, that's exactly what I found when I moved to New York City in the 1980s. And who says you can't make progress? We did turn it around. By the way, I realized because Atlas Shrugged was written in 1957, attention spans were a little bit longer. I can assure you if John Galt were writing in an Atlas Shrugged written in 2007, he would have had a YouTube video. It would have been about 3 minutes long. It would have been a supplementary text with a website referral. So he would have gotten the message out. Ed Crane. I asked Ed how to introduce him, and Ed is known for his clear, crisp, succinct answers. He just said, just say, I've been in the tank for Ayn Rand since high school.
Thank you, John, for that gracious introduction. I just want to say at the top here that when Fred Smith compares Washington, D.C. to whorehouses, he's insulting whorehouses all around the world. I mean, after all, they're voluntary, right? And you know, my 16-year-old daughter's, she's a junior in high school, and her Spanish teacher made the class watch Al Gore's movie. And I was, I wanted to go, confront her, and my wife, Christina, who's in the crowd, would not let me. Because she knows I can be less than diplomatic at times. But then I thought, the bad news is what they're teaching the kids. The good news is that they're not learning any of it. At least my kids aren't. So I really appreciate the Atlas Society or the Objective Center or whatever the heck they call this place for doing this to honor the 50th anniversary of Atlas Shrugged, because it is just such a marvelous book, such a great book that not only is inspiring to us, but it just infuriates all our enemies. So it's got everything going for it. I'm supposed to talk about Atlas and the fight for freedom, and it's so obvious the influence this book has had on all the efforts over the years since its publication to promote liberty. I think, by the way, that it's interesting that in the middle of of the 20th century, the major advocates, the most passionate advocates of liberty were women. Isabel Patterson, Rose Wilder Lane, and Ayn Rand. Rand, obviously the most influential of the group, but the other two having had considerable influence on Rand's thinking too. But it was a book that really changed the world, I think, and certainly inspired a lot of people to get involved with the battle for a free society. If you look at the think tanks, whether it's Competitive Enterprise Institute or the Cato Institute, the original Manhattan Institute, the Heartland Institute, the Mackinac Center, the Pacific Research Institute, certainly the Reason Foundation, the top leaders of those organizations were all profoundly influenced by Ayn Rand. I, in my wayward youth, ran the Libertarian Party, and it was known as the Crane Machine back then. I had, but the people you knew you could count on were the ones who were objectivists, who had read Ayn Rand and who read Atlas Shrugged. When we do a survey, we send out applications at Cato for our summer internships. We get 1,000 applications for 25 or 6 slots. And we ask, one of the questions is, what books have influenced you the most? And more than half of them will say Atlas Shrugged. And those are the ones I'm most interested in, because I really think it's important to have a rights-based approach to liberty. And it's interesting because there is this battle between natural rights and utilitarians. David Bowes, my colleague at Cato, had an exchange with Bob Bidinano in the then Objectivist Center magazine that was very civil and intelligent, I thought. And David made the point that all objectivists are libertarians by definition, whereas we know all libertarians are not objectivists. And I think it's an interesting distinction, because from my perspective, I want people who are grounded in philosophy for why individual liberty is important. At the same time, and this is where I've had some differences with my objectivist friends, I would much rather have somebody who is just a utilitarian, who just thinks, you know, live and let live, hasn't thought about the philosophy, just believes that freedom works. And then somebody who's steeped in philosophy who happens to be a socialist. There's nothing wrong with having allies who don't agree with you on every step of the way to liberty. And I think it's just odd that there would be this attitude among objectivists that you don't want to associate with the libertarian movement because there are people in there who are utilitarians. I mean, this is the group that has the highest percentage of objectivists of any movement in America. And you want to say, no, we don't want to associate with them. That's wrong. And that's what I've always liked about what David Kelly and Ed Hudgens have done. They've had an open mind about this sort of thing. And increasingly, I think, happily, the Ayn Rand Institute is starting to move in that direction. Because I think it's so important for libertarians and objectivists to work together. I mean, all the top leadership at the Cato Institute consider themselves objectivist. And